Hello, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today. I am delighted to be able to introduce a friend of Microsoft and also a huge speaker within the industry, Ariane Donahue.
Hi, James.
Thank you so much for joining us. We have a lot of stuff to cover, but we're talking about retail and the retail peak, and particularly sort of getting ready for Black Friday and all of that stuff. So, but before we kind of get to that, we've seen an awful lot of change happening in the industry over the last 3 years. And I just wondered from your perspective, what are the things that you've seen in your roles sort of across both agency and kind of in-house? How has that changed?
Yeah, there's been a few key trends, probably 3 or 4 things that stand out more than anything else. The first is that there is now this huge expectation for convenience that there never was before. People expect things now, they expect a high quality of service, and for things to be exactly the way they want them when they want them. But then allied to that, you're also seeing a shift in the kinds of experiences people have, where particularly when they do move beyond online and they go onto the high street, people are looking for something different from the shops that they go into and the brands they interact with. But then that also goes hand in hand with a huge section of the audience looking for more mindful shopping.
Yeah.
So whether that's things that are more environmentally friendly or items that perhaps won't have planned obsolescence built in. So you see people increasingly holding on to things like mobile phones instead of for 2 years, maybe for 3 or 4 years, or buying refurbished, both from a cost-saving point of view, but also an environmental point of view. So that in some ways flies a little in the face of everything that Black Friday and the retail peak around the Christmas period stands for, but it's interesting to see those trends start to coexist with one another.
Yeah, so we see I think there's that really interesting balance between you have the convenience being the new normal and that drive for I expect everything just when I need it. But then also that more sort of sustainability coming through and the experiential type of shopping. So with those sort of trends in mind, how are you adapting to that as someone who works in a search agency, and how are you having to make changes based on those trends?
So the single biggest thing we're having to do is make sure that we're where customers expect us to be. So that's particularly true with things like your search campaigns, shopping campaigns. Obviously people now expect to be able to find your products there, but then also other channels that people now associate so heavily with retail, making sure that if that's right for the clients we work with, ensuring that they have a presence there as well. But even going so far as things like social advertising, we talked about this before we started filming, but the amount of things that we now buy through social media from a retail perspective that I wouldn't have done 2 or 3 years ago. And as a marketer, I would have thought I wouldn't fall for that I wouldn't see some beautifully targeted ad on Instagram and buy this random glove for my cat that's great at getting rid of the fur that she needs to shed. She's terrified of it, but it's really effective. And I bought that on a whim. And there's so many random things that I've bought for myself now through social advertising that as a marketer I wouldn't necessarily have expected. So there's also that having to look at things with slightly more consumer facing eyes, and not thinking about things so much as a marketer, because there's perhaps that gap between what I think works and what actually works, and so we're having to close that.
But often I find that's really interesting, because we as consumers maybe we switch our marketing hat off. But then every now and again you just go, gosh, that's some really nice piece of targeting, and they've got me just at the right time, and then you end up buying it. So having that customer centric focus is incredibly important. Yeah. So as we sort of think and move more towards thinking around peak season and Black Friday, what are the things that you're seeing, and how are we having to kind of change to make sure that at such a sort of concentrated peak, how do you set yourself apart from all of the competitors out there?
It's really hard, as you say, because the market in particular gets really saturated. Costs increase, more people are looking, and there's more people in the market. So it's a really difficult one. The biggest tip I would say for people is about planning. Unfortunately, life often gets in the way, and we don't always get to plan our campaigns as early as we perhaps would like. But even now, with say 6 to 8 weeks to go, there's still plenty that advertisers can do to try and get ready. And obviously one of the biggest things is making sure that you're where people expect you to be. So things like your shopping campaigns, make sure that you have these ready essentially, and one of the big things to do there is going to be to look at your product feed. So does it work? Does it have the right images? Do you want to update anything to make sure that your descriptions and your keyword matching is where it needs to be? making sure that you talk to the right people within your business, because some of these changes aren't quick to make, and if you leave things like that too late, you may not have time should you need to. But then also think about the data you have. Audiences are so key now with marketing in this period, because you may not want to target everybody in the run up to Black Friday. That can be incredibly expensive. You might only want to target your most loyal customers, or maybe those who've expressed interest in your brand before and for some reason never purchased. So think about the data that you have and how you can use it. And as you mentioned, come back to that more marketing-centric way of thinking. What challenges is it that your customers have? How can you solve them? What products and services are you offering that actually fit a need that people have? But most importantly, what should the message be? I think all too often in the world of digital, and I know I've been guilty of this, the message is often the afterthought. We think about the targeting first, and then what we want to say to people. Who am I going to go
after? And then we'll worry about the actual creative afterwards.
Whereas what I would advise people is to think more about the message, as that's the thing that's going to help you stand out in a sea that's going to be so crowded in this time period, and then think about the targeting after that. But do focus on one or two things that you know you can do really, really well, because with it being such a busy time and with us being short on time, it would be best to pick one or two things. But also don't be afraid to opt out of Black Friday if it's not right for your business.
Got it. So, I mean, we've touched on a couple of products there. Like, what do you see as the things that are being those real game-changing products that have made a big difference maybe in the last year or so? Or what are some of the new things that you're seeing that is going to make a big difference for people, that is going to allow them to have that more consumer-focused approach and make sure that it really does sort of hit those things that they want to achieve?
So you know that I'm a big fan of automation, at least when used well.
Sure.
I think it has huge potential to free up our time for more important things. I remember years ago finding out when automated bidding was going to become a thing. It's like, oh, what am I going to do with my time? What will my job be if I can't change keyword bids anymore? But the reality is there's so much more that we can do from a creative point of view, thinking about audience and message, and looking at the businesses we work with and becoming more strategic.
There's always going to be that need, right, for kind of the human creativity. So as much as we can take away from that manual optimization with something like auto bidding, just frees you to be that sort of creative force.
It really does, and that's where I think things like smart bidding have real value to add to users. I'd be careful of using some of the strategies at this time of year just because performance can change so suddenly. So given, as we know, that they run off historic data and they analyse that to try and predict what will happen in the future, given that you can't necessarily predict for an event like Black Friday other than looking at past year's data, and they don't always look back that far, these algorithms, I'd advise people to think carefully about any strategies, particularly if you've not used them before and you're thinking about testing them. Probably don't test them now, but if you want to use an automated strategy to make sure that you're making the most of your traffic, maybe look at something like enhanced CPC, because that will look at someone's propensity to convert and will upweight the bid if it thinks there's more of an opportunity there. People obviously need to make sure they've got their audience lists up to scratch for things like remarketing, but then also have a look at how you can use a feature like custom audiences, which will allow you to target users that are maybe your most loyal or your most valuable, or those, as we said before, who've interacted with you but never purchased. But on that point, another great way to use audience data is through something like Microsoft Advertising's audience ads. So these are a keywordless campaign type that ingests data about user behavior, searches they've conducted, location, and all these other factors in real time, and based on the user's intent, then serves an ad to them as they browse around Microsoft properties. So you're not competing in search with everybody else at a really, really busy time. You have the ability to target them elsewhere as they're browsing the web in a slightly more natural, native format. But because you can add images, that can also be really helpful for retail at this time of year.
And one of the things we've found with that is, particularly when you're doing that sort of more top of funnel sort of look for not necessarily people who are ready to buy right at that moment, but building the brand awareness, using it in the native environment is a great way to do that. And then layering on the other things, so something like in-market audiences, remarketing we talked about, is a great way to start adding that extra granular targeting to go after those audiences.
And because it's a relatively new product, it's not seeing the same levels of competition, although hopefully it will after this video, that you get across areas like search. So it is much easier to compete and actually get really, really good placements, even potentially on the homepage of sites like MSN, and have your ads seen by thousands of people in a time like this.
So we've covered a lot of ground there in a relatively short period of time. We talked about these sort of, I'd say the overarching trends of increased want for sustainability, the need for kind of always-on convenience, and then the sort of experiential things that people are doing on and offline. We've talked about some of the products that we think are really good to go after, making sure that you set up everything and have your targeting in the right place, not being over-reliant maybe on some of those auto-bidding strategies when the peaks can change so rapidly. Of all of the things that we've talked about, what's the one thing that you really want people to go away with? What would you say is the kind of one key takeaway from this that somebody could take for their preparation for Black Friday this year?
I would want them to plan. So if you decide that Black Friday is right for you, and it might not be, there are some businesses who decide that actually following the Black Friday trend isn't that productive for their business or their brand, and that's okay. But if you decide it is for you, you do still have time to have a really strong campaign and deliver some good results. So think about exactly who you want to target. It doesn't have to be the whole audience. It can just be a small section. Think about the message you want to convey. Do you want to target them with every product that you have or specific products? So just go back to basics and plan everything from scratch, and don't feel like you have to do everything, because it would be much better to focus on one thing and to do that really, really well than it would be to try and tackle everything and spread yourself too thin with poor results, because that could also then have huge negative impacts for your brand if something goes badly wrong. So yeah, focus on doing one thing well, plan, you've still got time to get it right. And yeah, don't be afraid to try something new. Don't be afraid to look outside of those traditional search keyword-based campaigns if you're worried about the cost.
Well, thank you, Ariane. That's some really useful insights, I think, for everyone who's listening for the webinar.
Thank you, James.
Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope that that gives you some food for thought and some really interesting insights, and we do hope this will help you have a really successful Black Friday for 2019.